It works. Amazing. Alright, so I'm planning that we can have a bit of a conversation. I'm planning to talk for about 10 or so minutes to the lovely slide deck, and then I want you to sort of talk to me about it and ask a question. So, if you were facilitating this, where would you want the chairs to be? And if you could come and pick a place where you'd like a chair to be someone sitting in, if you were facilitating this, that would be a great thing. Cool. I may have to sit down partway through this because it's get to the end of the day, so here we go. I'll give people another minute or so to come in. Thank you.
That's a group conversation, is it?
Yeah, definitely.
Or we could just let the kids off. I'm sure she
We're flexible, we'll let it emerge. Alright. We should get started then. Thank you very much for joining me for the last session for the day of the last conference. My name is Ballestrin, and I'm here to talk about how you can use the Cynefin framework with Agile, Lean and so forth. So that's that bit of slide done. Might be a good idea to go like this. Good. That works. Alright. So I'm the IT engagement lead for Agile at Telstra, for one of our lines of business in IT. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at how do we scale Agile. We've been looking at things like release trains and pipelines and so forth. And my role is actually to get projects and groups and so forth started on the Agile journey. So we're wondering, well, how do we get it at that big scale? It can easily work at a small team scale. And then the Cynefin frameworks come along. So I went to see Dave Snowden late last year. He came out to Melbourne with the Australian Computer Society, and then he held a one-day seminar. It was terrific, fantastic. I thought, oh, this is really good. And what I really liked about what he said was Agile and Lean and Scrum and so forth, they work, but we don't really understand why. And the Cynefin framework can help us to understand why those things work. Okay? So I was immediately interested in that. There we go. That's the Cynefin framework. Okay?
So how do you pronounce it?
Cynefin, and I'm probably not quite saying it properly, but Cynefin.
I had this conversation with the author of the framework on Twitter.
That's
You're just going to have to teach us how to say Welsh.
it, yes. So there we go. So it's got 5 domains in it, and it deliberately looks nice and organic. I quite like the way it looks. In the middle we've got disorder. And guess what? When you came into this room, it was actually in a bit of disorder. And I just said one simple instruction, and look, we've got a bit of a pattern happening. Isn't that amazing? Now, the reason that we do that is we're pattern matching animals. We've evolved that way because a long time ago, we learnt that if something big and yellow with great big sharp teeth is running towards us, we quickly pattern match and say, run away from that right now. Okay? So even when disorder exists, we tend to impose order on it or classify things. So disorder generally doesn't exist for very long when we humans are observing it. And then on the right-hand side, we've got what's called the ordered domains. And on the left-hand side, we've got the unordered domains. So that's the basic overview of the framework. We'll go a bit deeper next. So why do we use the Cynefin framework? You know, when something just feels right. So you're about to start a large piece of work, no one's sure of the outcome, and you go, really, we should do a bit of an experiment first, right? So this sort of framework can help you to test whether an experiment is the right thing to do. So what you do is you say, okay, for this thing that we want to do, is the outcome predictable, anyone could see it coming, and anyone with the basic skills can just run off and do it. Okay, if that's the case, we're sitting in the simple domain, right? Because things are predictable there. We can have best practice there because it's repeatable and it's predictable. The next domain is complicated. So this is where we might need to workshop a few things, we might need to get some experts in. Most people who haven't developed the expertise can't actually do this work, but someone can. So that's the complicated domain, and a good example for me is a car engine. I could probably pull one to bits, although I did try to pull a Mercedes one to bits once, and I didn't have the right bits, so I couldn't pull it to bits very far. But I'm not a mechanic, so I can't put one back together. I don't have the expertise. So car engines for me are in the complicated domain. Then the complex domain is where we can't predict the outcome. And when we can't predict the outcome, what we want to do is we want to test. We want to test it. We want to see what works and what doesn't work. And when we do that, and even when something fails, we still learn from it. So we learn about how that domain's working. When something's bad, we kind of stop it. And when something's good, we amplify it. So that's complex. And in the chaotic domain, a good example of that is a natural disaster or a one outage on the system. First thing you do is get the system back up and running or stop people from dying, whatever's appropriate. And then everything else kind of starts to fall into place. So that's the slightly deeper overview of it. Now I'll give you some examples of how I use it. So in its most basic form, you can use it as a bit of a classification method. So I had a team, and in that team we had 10 types of reports that we needed to get created. So that's what the 10 little cards are. And what I said to the team was, well, which of these reports do we know exactly where we can get the data from? We maybe even think the report already exists and we can just go off and do it. That was great. There were 2 of those. That was simple. We could just go off and get them done. The next one was, well, which ones we're not quite sure where to get the data. We're pretty confident it exists, and if we ask the right person, we'll get the right answer. There were 6 of those. So we decided we'd do some analysis and workshops on those. And then there were 2 left over. It was like, we don't even know if we really need this data. We might have to do some of these workshops here to try and figure out whether we can even get this data or whether it's going to be of any value. So what we did with those 2 is we treated the complicated part of the work as a bit of an experiment, and we decided to wait for those. And what that meant is instead of having a whole bunch of workshops on 10 different reports, we actually focused our workshops and our analysis work onto the 6. And so that helped us to make a good decision. Now, without the Never framework, we probably would have made the same decision. It's kind of a gut feel thing. You know, stuff's obvious, you just go and do it, or that kind of thing. But it gave me the framework to have the conversation with the team to help us make sure that we're making the right decisions. Which is good, because this is about decision making. This is a drawing that I drew up to explain how we're making decisions in a very large program of work at the moment. So what we do is we sort ideas into 3 categories. We've got some things that the outcome is uncertain on. We've got some things where analysis is required, and we've got some things where the outcome is predictable. And what we do is, if it's uncertain, we'll experiment. So that's what the little e's are. We'll run the experiments through the pipeline one at a time. And if it's bad, we'll stop. If it's good, we go to analyse or build. And if we're not sure, then we'll do the fancy term of pivot, and we'll go into a new experiment. And the same with analysis, the same sort of thing. You can have the bad outcome and you stop, good, go to build. If you're not sure, let's do an experiment and find out. And if the outcome's predictable, that's when we can go straight into build. Now at a program level, just to keep it safe, we've got this lovely graph here, how much are we spending and how much revenue are we making or whatever, benefit. As long as the graph's going to go this way, good. But if at the whole program level, it's not going that way, we'll stop.
Sorry, there's a question. At what stage in your cycle would you sort of apply this framework? Is it like following project release, before, middle?
This is when we're deciding what work to do, because, so right at the idea stage.
In your backlog planning, when you're sorting your backlog.
Yeah, so backlog of ideas. So in this one we've got sort of, at the moment, we've got 15 ideas that we're sorting through. And right now they're all going through various phases of these and these. In fact, there's only one that we've put straight through into build so far. We've only started two. One's an experiment, one's build. And most of those are actually going through market research. So that's a good example of analysis required.
So we apply agile methods, we're just planning the next phase rather than deciding whether our approach is correct or not.
Yeah, and also the funny thing about the Canberra framework is things move around the framework. So today we might have classified something as the outcome's uncertain, and tomorrow that could change, or it's probably more likely the other way. Some things that we think are predictable, suddenly something happens in the market, or something happens in the world, and the whole world's changed, and you can't really do that. Yeah, so this is how we think about the work. It's not how we execute the work, because you can still execute all of these waterfall, agile, or whatever. This is about how we classify the work and think about it. So we're not just going, oh, hang on, this. Right now we usually assume we go straight into build. Right. And then, oh, there we go. It's a short talk just to get started. So where to find more information?
Just a question across the board. How do you, when you mention experiment, you mentioned it on field. So what kind of experiments are you talking about?
Now experiments can vary in size. So the simplest experiment I can think of that I've done is to have a conversation with someone. So I like to push the boundaries on things. So I'll say, I want to try and change a particular process. And I'll go and have a conversation with someone who I know is influential in that process and say, I'm thinking of changing this process. Instead of doing this, I want to do this. And my experiment is, are they going to be receptive to that or not? Right? If they're not, maybe I'll pivot and try something else. And if they are, well, I'll go on to the next person and have a conversation with them. And it can be even, there's others where we're spending, whatever, to actually build something and test it. So that can cost whatever you want. So it can be a 5-minute thing, or it can be a long thing. So we'll get more information, and we'll have more conversation here as well. But we've got the, we should do this at the end. Yeah? Good. All right, so what I wanted to do now is ask if you've got any questions, because I've just given you a very small, brief overview. So what questions have we got?
Okay, so where did in your last slide, which holes did they go into?
Ah, beautiful. That's a very good question. Okay, I think that's right.
I think I know, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. And that was me without saying the framework. Good. So the outcome uncertain is the complex domain. Analysis required is the complicated domain. And outcome predictable is the simple domain.
Why do you keep missing out chaotic?
Well, chaotic is fine. Most projects we don't plan to have chaos. So there's not really much point having a funnel full of chaos. And there's quite a lot of things you can do. You can actually deliberately dip into chaos if you want to, but that's kind of a much more in-depth conversation to have and requires a huge amount of skill set.
But what would be the funnel for chaos? It would be, because all of those funnels end in and getting into one of the other funnels, which all ends in getting into the build funnel, right? So what would be the funnel for chaos to get it out of chaos?
It's whatever it takes to get it out of chaos. So it might be, say it's a Sev1 fault, and you have to actually build a piece of code to deploy it tonight to fix the Sev1 fault, right? Or to deploy it in the next 5 minutes, right? So that would be a build. And you probably wouldn't do too much about analysis and experimentation when you're actually in chaos. You're acting, right? So actually that's right. You would do some simple things. Okay, so let's think about it as an emergency situation. What firefighters and police officers and all those kind of professionals do is they train for those disaster scenarios. And the reason they train is to make the practices that they do when those things are happening just simple. They come to them very easily. So they know that they're going to automatic mode when they have to rescue somebody.
So that's race response act.
Yeah.
Yeah, that thing.
Yeah, so they, first of all, they act and they stop people from dying, and then they do whatever else. And what you'll find is once you've gotten over the emergency, then nearly every other activity that you do will fall into those buckets. Right. The other thing is that when you're in the simple domain, it can quite easily go into the kind of chaotic domain. That's why there's those little legs at the bottom of the things, it's a cliff. So if you've got a simple process and suddenly something changes that you didn't realise was changing, it can all fall over in a heap. So I use the example of filling up glasses of water. I can predict that, I can get really good at it. If I suddenly start filling them with boiling water, they'll explode. And they're going to chaos and mess all over the floor, clean it up, get onto it again.
So what I also know about this framework is that that people can fall into the different slots. And I know that I can deal with one of them, the one that's got the known outcome. Which one's that? Complicated.
So complicated.
Yeah, I can deal with complicated, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot deal with complex.
Yeah, complex is really hard, and normal management practices work really well in the simple and complicated domains. And we're really only just now, as a management theory or practice or whatever, starting to even understand that we need to change for complex situations, let alone know how to do that. So the simplest thing to say is, oh, let's do a whole bunch of experiments, but that's about all we really know at the moment in management.
That's really the only way to get out of complex. Do experiments.
If it's truly a complex domain, the outcome is never predictable. So Dave Snowden has a really good video where he describes a children's party. And in it, so when you're running a children's party, that's actually a complex system. Because we don't go in there as an expert and say, children, you're going to be learning these outcomes during this party, and you don't go at the end of the survey and say, was it a good party?
It's chaos.
Well, it can be chaos, but what you do is you watch for weak signals. So we scan for weak signals, we see what's good. So the kids are playing with a cricket ball near the window, you take that away, you dampen that, and give them a Nerf ball. And then if something great is happening, you get more kids involved in it. So that's what you do in a complex space, and it's not, if it's truly complex, the outcome isn't predictable. If we had exactly the same party and everybody did exactly the same thing, the second time the party would be just as good. So no, it wouldn't, because what made the party great was how those interactions were dampened or amplified during the previous party, not actually what occurred.
So the interesting thing about experimentation or prototyping is that, I want to do it because I feel that it gets it from that level of complexity to complicated, that you can get some outcomes and you can get some process and you can get a way forward. And then you've got the hierarchy saying, I want results. I want them now. I want you to tell me what the answer is right now.
Yes.
And that's really, really hard.
It is. Yeah, because if you can't predict an outcome, you can't measure it. Where we go with complex about measurement is looking at large amounts of data and looking for the patterns in the data. And how do you measure whether you've got a blob of data of outliers here that were bad things happening and you move them towards the good stuff and you know that it was a good outcome? How can you prove that? How can you measure it? How should you measure it? By moving that blob of bad stuff into the other part, you might have moved another blob out. So it's a constantly moving thing.
When you're talking about data, you do have a known. You've got a constraint. You've got the data to deal with. Right? When you're talking about the nth degree that is systems design, you don't have any. You've got to find what the constraints are, or you've got to make some constraints to help it get into the complicated rather than the complex.
Yes.
Put some boundaries around it.
Yeah, and sometimes you can break things apart as well. So some part of it truly is complex and always will stay in that domain, but you can break out a part of it and it'll go into complicated.
Do you define as watch items up there when you're saying that each activity monitors watch items?
So I don't like the term governance, so I use the term diligence instead. And this in the projects that I've been working with, what we do is we agreed at the start of the project a set of weekly watch items, and they can be 3 things, 5 things, 7 things. Normally there's 2 standard ones, which is what's the budget we've got, how much have we spent, how much we've got left.
Yep.
So in other words, if you've got $10 and you've already spent 5 and you've still got, you spend 1 week and you've still got 10 weeks to go, then you're up the creek, right?
Yep.
So that's one watch item. The other one is overall budget. So if you thought something was going to cost $20 by the end of the project, and you get 3 weeks into the project and find, oh no, it's 100. Okay, you've got to make a decision about whether you stop or keep going. So the idea of they're the watch items that you use, and it can be a few other agreed things. One might be a date. So we have to hit Christmas, right? Because it's a Christmas special or something like that.
Yep.
That's a real date, and it's a date you really need to watch and manage to. You need to make decisions about. So each week we monitor the watch items so that we can make a keep going or stop decision there and then, so that if we stop, we can then return any remaining funds back to be done, to be used for more useful work. Yeah.
So you typically steer away from like cycle times or actual build activities or analysis. It's mainly maintained at a higher level.
Yeah, this is what I think makes sense
Yep.
for the stakeholders who care about how we're going.
Yeah.
And it's a really good safety net because most projects don't decide deliberately whether they're going to stop or keep going every single week.
Yep.
Any other questions? Maybe we'll go on to where you can get more info and then we can come back to questions as well. So the Cognitive Edge website has excellent resources. It's got the links to all the videos. So if you want to look at it for 5 minutes, you can look at a 5-minute YouTube video. If you want to do weeks and weeks and weeks of research, there's articles, there's blogs, there's a huge, deep amount of information about the complexity space available. Also upcoming training and events. So the next one in Melbourne is Advanced Practitioners in late August. And we've got the Cynefin Melbourne meetup group. We meet about every 3 weeks. And yeah, it's just a way for all of us to meet. Because the Cynefin framework has mostly been used in health, in government and defence in the past, and has only recently been recognised that it's useful for agile and lean and so forth. So it's quite new in our software industry, but it's been around a long time in others. So the reason I formed the Melbourne Meetup Group was to get the other people in Melbourne who are working particularly in other industries to join us so that we can all learn from each other. So that's basically where to get more information from. So,
Can you explain that thing again? Now that you said, I've never picked that up before, that actually has a meaning.
yeah. This is so cool. This is a cliff. So every other line, it's not too hard for things to move across those other boundaries. But moving this boundary is pretty easy to go from simple into chaotic. It's actually a very hard push uphill to get it back into simple. You know, when a program or project goes completely off the rails and you get someone in who's a bit of a project manager who says, darn it, get on with it, stop doing that, start doing this bit of command and control stuff. What they're actually trying to do is they're trying to push from a chaotic situation to a simple situation, which is like pushing up a cliff. So what it can be easier to do if you've got the luxury is to try and move it more into the complex space, then complicate it and back into simple. Yeah. So, and did you notice these other words here in between? So there's a lot of information just on this diagram.
They've all got sense.
They all have sense, yeah. Because it's important to sense. I was having a conversation with Renee Troughton last evening, and we were talking about slack time, and I suddenly realised, especially for managers, but for all of us, if we use that slack, what we call slack time for scanning, you know how I said we had lots of data and we scan for patterns? Now, that can be walking up to the wall and looking at the patterns, or looking at, if you're a manager of like 10 agile teams, walking to 10 walls and looking at the patterns. And if you go to that much information and you see, oh, every single one of them has this thing here, what does that mean? It might mean something really good, might mean something really bad, something definitely to look at. So scanning time rather than cycle time. If we spend our time sensing, especially that kind of information, the data that we've already got available, and looking for the patterns, it can tell us a heck of a lot of information. So in the simple environment, we sense, then we categorise, then we respond. So the simple, what's a good simple example? I'm sorting out beads. Okay, so I've got red, green and yellow beads. Pick it up, my eyes tell me it's green, I put it in the green bucket. So I sensed it, I categorised it, and I responded. In complicated, we sense, then we analyse, then we respond. So I'm trying to fix a car engine on a mechanic. I go, oh, this bit looks like 3 other bits that could go in 3 different spots. Analysis, it's actually bit A, put it into slot A. Complex, we probe, sense and respond. I used an example the other day. Has anyone seen the movie The Fifth Element? Okay, so some have, some haven't. There's this great big ball planet thing that's evil coming towards the Earth, right? It's science fiction. And what they do, I think they send a probe in first, and that doesn't really tell them anything. Then they send a missile, they try to blow it up, okay? But because it's evil, it absorbs it and it gets even better. So of course then they send 10 missiles at it or something. Anyway, what they're doing is they're probing, and then they're seeing what happens. So probe, sense, then respond. And well, actually what happened then is that kind of we all had to run away very quickly because it started coming very fast towards the Earth. That's right. Okay, so probe, sense, yeah. So sometimes when you probe and you see it's going bad, yes.
Run away, response.
Then you might have to do a fast response, that's right. Cool. And then chaotic, act, then sense, then respond. So that's, again, back to the training for emergency services personnel. That's to help them to act first and then sense. So first of all, let's save people, then let's see what's going on, and then respond.
So it's interesting that the sense is first on that side and the sense is second on that side.
Correct. Yeah, it's a huge amount of information. A lot of thought has gone into designing the framework.
Yeah.
And different practices. So best practice, we talk about best practice a lot. And you know, best practice doesn't work in complex. And the reason why some people want to dip into chaos is because you can get novel practices happening. But again, that's something that I'm still trying to get my head around.
Well, that's why I mentioned about chaos before, because normally if you dip into chaos, that's where your risk is, and from risk is opportunity.
Correct.
And that's where you sometimes want to dip into that chaos area.
That's right. Yeah. The other thing that data centers talks about is when you've got, I said one incident, for example, in a software system, and you've got a team quickly trying to fix it, if you can afford it, if you can have another team working alongside them, looking at what are the ultimate root causes, oh, hang on, what are they doing, oh, hang on, that's where you get the novel things emerging as well, because if it's the team that's actually trying to
So you've got one team acting and one team sensing.
Correct. Yeah. Perfect. Cool.
And it's interesting that actually software can fall into each one of the holes. Like an ERP system, you know, takes things from complicated to simple. Yeah. So that's the whole idea of an ERP system, is to get simple, to get people processes within the organisation. But there are so many things in the organisation that can't be repeatable, it can't be best practice, it can't be that. So they, you know, they're complex systems.
Yeah. We think about waterfall with the waterfall process, if it's used in its most basic form, treats everything as simple. Now it can be tailored to work. Again, this framework is not specific to any particular methodology. So one way I've compared it is your agile lean systems thinking are kind of tools that you use to help you directly build something like a trowel when you're building a wall. Okay, so you put the mortar on the brick. This framework is like a level or a streamline to help you guide the wall, to help guide you towards the wall.
So it seems like waterfall, the end result is to get everything into best practice, to get everything to simple. But the world doesn't work like that. Some things need to stay chaotic.
Some things are complex.
Yeah.
That's right. So some things are truly complex, and the value of trying to work out how to predict them, or the effort that you put in trying to work out how to predict them, doesn't give you the value. So it's better to do something different in that space. game for time? In minutes too. So what do you want to do? Do you want to talk a bit more about it? Do you want to leave early? Yeah. There is a closing, like we had the opening bit, so when we finish we'll go back down to the theatrettes as well. So, yeah. So if you just want to like mingle and chat, we can do that too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just roll myself. I'm really gelling with a really bad situation at the moment, and I just trying to make some sense out of it. And there is no sense.